Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Leilah Babirye and I am the Education Director at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum. The Aldrich is located on the ancestral homelands of the Wappinger and Munsee Lenape peoples, a place known as Richfield, Connecticut today. The Aldrich is a non-collecting institution and presents new exhibitions by emerging artists, established artists, and thematic group exhibitions throughout the year. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers, beginning with our moderator for today's conversation, curator and writer Legacy Russell, who is the executive director and chief curator of the Kitchen. She was formerly the associate curator of exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Russell holds a master's of research with distinction in art history from Goldsmiths, University of London, with a focus in visual culture. Her academic, curatorial, and creative work focuses on gender, performance, digital selfdom, internet idolatry, and new media ritual. Russell's written works, interviews, and essays have been published internationally, and she is the recipient of the Thoma Foundation 2019 Arts Writing Award in Digital Arts, a 2020 Rauschenberg Residency Fellow, and a recipient of the 2021 Creative Capital Award. Her first book is Glitch Feminism, a Manifesto, which was published in 2020. And her second book, Black Meme, is forthcoming via Verso Books. Legacy is here to moderate a conversation with the following group of artists included in the group exhibition 52 Artists, a Feminist Milestone, currently on view at the Aldrich Museum through January 8th, 2023. This exhibition is organized by the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum's chief curator, Amy Smith Stewart, independent curator, Alexandra Schwartz, and the Aldrich Museum's curatorial assistant and publications manager, Caitlin Monachino. Each of the following artists have a long list of accomplishments, so I will introduce everyone with an abbreviated introduction. Leilah Babirye was born in 1985 in Kampala, Uganda, and is an artist and activist living and working in Brooklyn, New York. She studied art at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda, and in 2018, she received asylum to the US with support from the African Services Committee at New York City Anti-Violence Project, while presenting her first solo exhibition at Gordon Robichaud in New York. Her multidisciplinary practice transforms everyday materials into objects that address issues surrounding identity, sexuality, and human rights. She is represented by Gordon Robichaud in New York and Stephen Friedman Gallery in London. Next up is Lizania Cruz, who was born in the Dominican Republic in 1983 and is a participatory artist, designer, interested in how migration affects ways of being and belonging. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Graphic Design at Philadelphia University. And through research, oral history, objects such as books, installations, videos, and much more, she creates projects in collaboration with a diverse range of communities that highlight a pluralistic narrative on migration and race. And next we have Aya Rodriguez-Izumi, who was born in Okinawa, Japan in 1986 and currently lives and works in New York. She earned a BFA from Parsons, the New School for Design, and an MFA for the School of Visual Arts. Aya writes that her practice deals with concepts of ritual retention in the face of ancestral trauma, colonization, and migration by calling on personal experiences from her Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Okinawan heritage. She aims to create a transformative environment and experience for the viewer with the goal of creating bridges for cultural understanding. She's also currently the Director of Programs and Engagement at Socrates Sculpture Park. And last but not least is Kiyan Williams, who was born in 1991 in Newark, New Jersey, and is an artist and writer based in New York. A bachelor's with honors from Stanford University and an MFA in visual art from Columbia University. They are attracted to quotidian, unconventional materials and methods that evoke the historical, political, and ecological forces that shape individual and collective bodies. They are currently a lecturer at Parsons MFA program. And lastly, I want to remind everyone to please use the Q&A function to ask any questions during the conversation, and we will address those questions at the end of the program. With that, please welcome Legacy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And thank you, of course, to each of our inspiring panelists for your presence and participation today. So again, to introduce myself, my name is Legacy Russell. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Curator at The Kitchen in New York City. The Kitchen, which is based in Chelsea and temporarily sited at Westbeth while we prepare for a forthcoming renovation, has been a dynamic meeting place of experimental art and the avant-garde, defying disciplines since its inception in 1971. So thinking of the 70s, it's my absolute pleasure to be here with you all to reflect on this groundbreaking exhibition that is the inspiration for the 52 Artists, a feminist milestone that celebrates really the 51st anniversary of the historic exhibition, 26 Contemporary Women Artists, that was curated by Lucy Lepard in 1971. So, you know, it's a challenging framework that we're stepping into this afternoon, because, you know, certainly there are so many components of this that, you know, we are going to be unpacking, asking about what arcs to the present day from 71 to this moment here and now, and certainly too thinking about the ways in which we have expanded intersectionally some of these questions that Lepard put forward. But, you know, the original exhibition, to kind of give some context for those who are new to this history, was on view at the Aldrich from April 18th to June 13th, 1971. Brought together 26 women artists. And as well, you know, Lucy Lepard viewed this curating as a kind of landmark exhibition because it was part of what, you know, she kind of framed as an activist gesture. In its original catalog, she states, "I took on this show because I knew there were many women artists whose work was as good or better than most currently being shown, but who, because of the prevailingly discriminatory policies of most galleries and museums, can rarely get anyone to visit their studios or take them as seriously as their male counterparts." So Aldrich Contemporary has a phenomenal chief curator, Amy Smith-Stewart, who wrote a beautiful essay for this exhibition. And in the essay, Smith-Stewart calls into the room the late and great Professor Bell Hooks with her decree and reminder of feminism is for everybody. So we're here today to really put that to the test, and maybe as we get started, to begin with the question of what does feminism mean to you, and as well, who maybe are some of the icons or sort of spirits, if you will, that represent this as a kind of framework and a history. So Aya, perhaps you can get us started, and we'll maybe go through each of our speakers and have you respond to that question.
Oh crap, I feel like I got the big question and I'm like the first one. I was hoping to not be first, but
we'll start with a broad frame. What does feminism mean to you, right? What are some folks, you know, that might embody that as a spirit?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Lizania and I had been actually talking about this a couple weeks ago too, but I think it's a really complex thing. And I think that a lot of work that has like feminist intent maybe is kind of something that, you know, the artist and the people who are seeing it has to do with both of them. That works, that like, you know, I'm kind of interested in the folks who are dealing with ideas that intersect with feminism, but maybe are not necessarily self-identified as feminist artists. So I think it's like that kind of expansion that, like, especially with this kind of like this new half of the show that like we're all in, is kind of doing that, because I think it really is trying to expand that idea. What does it mean? What does that work look like? What can that work talk about? And I think it's honestly kind of like a baseline thing, you know, and maybe says like more about viewers than necessarily the makers of it. You know, what creates like a feminist statement, or what does that even look like, or what does it have to be talking about? yeah. I don't
I
know.
think I think it's a great place to maybe push further, right? And I'm wondering if any of our amazing speakers on the line would like to expand on that, thinking about this question of, how to define, and maybe ask as well, right? Is it even useful to just define? And I, kind of using that word useful to be provocative in this context, but really because, Aya, as you noted, this question of feminism and how it is applied, right? It's sticky, and the folks, that may be called into the room, right, actually, may not self-identify as feminists, may exist outside of frameworks that are kind of historic feminist frameworks, given the models of exclusion that have been applied across those different milestones and benchmarks, right? So I'm keen to hear from some of our other speakers here about, what your thoughts are in terms of that kind of entry point. What is this question of feminism? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to engage with that question, which is like, so, as you said, just like rich and ripe with possibilities. But, I really came into like my feminist consciousness, specifically through like a Black feminist praxis. And so some folks like you've already named, like Bell Hooks or Angela Davis, the Combahee River Collective, Audre Lorde, Assata Shakur, like the litany really does go on. But I'm really thinking about, I'm naming a lot of writers and poets and community organizers who operated across these kinds of modes of thinking and making, and who were interested in like pushing against and really breaking open interlocking systems of oppression, and thinking about power and relationship to race, gender, class, immigration status. But that kind of, I don't want to say it exists outside of or like visual art practice for me, but I think of a different set of folks when I think about like artists who may or may not identify as being engaged with a visual art, or who may or may not self-identify as feminists, but who similarly do that work of like breaking open or disrupting within their respective practices. And for me, that's like namely folks like Beverly Buchanan and Ana Mendieta, as like sort of direct, folks who I want to invoke, and who I'm like always, who I feel like, I guess I'm naming like a kind of world making practice. And so I see them as a part of artists who have like built pathways and blueprints that I get to like walk into and make my creative practice possible.
Lizania, Leilah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I could. I mean, so many of like, similarly to Kiyan, like, I think of Audre Lorde. I think of, for me, that's a Dominican feminist, Sonia Pierre, who was working with very much like around bringing consciousness to Dominican Haitian descent. And Bell Hooks as well, Barbara Leon. But I guess similarly, I think because I'm part of a women's organizing group called the National Women's Liberation Movement. And I too came to my feminist consciousness, I think like last on like my identity consciousness, if I would say so. And for me, is really, I like to define it as like pretty much the idea of breaking male supremacy as like one of the things that are the monolithics that we deal with every day. So and within the arts is I similarly, I think of Ana Mendieta, and I think of spaces like AIR Gallery that are kind of like the spaces that, it was like women coming together in order to sort of fight and show their own work in a space that there wasn't any space or conversation for us. But even an institution of such power there is a lot of histories that are invisible within like the gender fight, and are kind of now trying to have like those conversations about what happens with like trans folks and where are those stories within that history. So I think, yeah, and like the conversation that Aya and I were having a couple weeks ago, we were talking about sort of like, why is it important to identify as like a feminist artist or not? Is it important? Is it that we identify as a feminist artist, making the same sort of like reciprocal cycles of always categorizing ourselves, rather than like, we want to just make the work that we want to make and explore kind of like the themes that we want to explore.
Leilah, any thoughts? I'm snapping too, and I have a question on top of a question, but I want to hear from Leilah before we move on to maybe the next strand of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Legacy. So to me, as a particular way of defining feminism is, finding equal rights basically for women, not only, about their sexuality, but also getting to politics itself, and also getting awareness out there, to a lot of things of equality. Like why would we like not to be like other humans because they're male? So to me, I feel like that is how I would define it, as Babirye Leilah, who is an activist. and does that also come with who my icons are? Okay.
Yes, yeah, I'm curious about a few icons. I want to call the icons into the room, right? And that's a great place for us to start.
Let's go for that. So for me, as a person who comes direct from Africa, I'm just going to talk about Africa, the African continent, and things that have inspired me, and people that literally inspired me. And I'm going to talk about the things that are basically from the 80s, because I'm from the 80s. I'm born in the 80s, and I'm going to talk about women that I've grown seeing, mostly my professors. I always talk about my professors and other strong women that are in the country that have really come up to talk about human rights, basically on women status. I'm going to first talk about the 1980. In the 1980, where we had, oh my God, even panicking. I'm going to talk about the Beijing Women Conference that was basically organized by one of my professors by then, Dr. Lizania Cruz, which was in the 80s. And it was basically in the arts, where she thought, why don't women come up, by then at the art school, and just, come up with an art show that just talk about women and their rights at that particular time. And when you also look at the political environment in Uganda, where we have a president who's been in power for 37 years now, that is in the 80s. And during the Guerrilla War, people who kind of helped to bring him in power were women. And I'll give examples of Winnie Byanyima and Milia Batembe, who were like on the front line. And after the war, they kind of came out and came into big posts by then, though right now they're not in offices because of various reasons, but they pushed forward at that particular time to talk about women equality. And they're still big figures right now in the country. But this started way back in the 80s. I also not talk about just Uganda, where I come from, but still, when you look at Miriam Makeba in South Africa, who kind of just stood up and started, in her music and sing about what she really believed in at that time, that this is, we need our rights as women. When you also look at Miriama Oba from Senegal, I think you've also read about her. These are icons that we literally forget. And I'm also going to talk about now my generation, where I'm going to talk about people like Bombastic Kasha and Naba Geseda. Jacqueline, I don't know if familiar about her. She actually, the founder, she helped finding a lot of LGBTI organizations in Uganda. She's a woman, and she kind of helped a lot. When you also look at Zenali Moholi's work in South Africa, where she literally just decided to take photos of women just photos of women and gay people in South Africa. In Africa, actually, she did that all over Africa, where she has specific human rights activists who are women, trans women and men, girl. You know, it's basically about how they've really influenced our generation to kind of come up and speak up. And also kind of follow their roots. Those are my major icons. And not forgetting me myself. Through
I
my
love
work.
that. I
You
love that.
know,
No, it's true.
I feel like I'm also doing a great job in, you know, just identifying us and what we really want in life.
I so appreciate that, Leilah, and I want to just say absolutely to the point of icons, each of you certainly are. So it's great to hold space for the iconic positions of those who are in the room. But you know, I think that each of you have brought up some questions that have been important about equity, right? And so maybe want to kind of pull ourselves out a little bit to ask about this question of, you know, what are we fighting for, or what are we struggling for, or is it a struggle? What does that look like, right? And also maybe the relationship too between one's advocacy, activism, space held, right? How those things, of course, can function through and beyond institutions. So, you know, we know very much so that, you know, part of the work that Lepard kind of spurred forward was asking the question about who is visible, who is seen, who is included in the conversation, right? But also, as we know very much so, you know, thinking about a non-binary discourse, a femme discourse, right? That within this, there are intersections that are structural, right? That really require us to do maybe a different type of examination about what it means to have art spaces, institutional spaces, creative spaces enact models of care differently. And that can look like, you know, family time policies, you know, thinking about pay benchmarking, asking about collection practices within museum spaces. So certainly the exhibition is almost, you know, kind of very small sliver of a broader kind of puzzle, if you will, of things to solve towards and to strategize on. So, you know, I'd love for each of you maybe to share, or for those maybe who have thoughts on this, to maybe speak to this question of, you know, what are institutions for, right? Because, you know, Aya, for example, you know, in terms of your relationship as being an artist who works inside of institutions, right? And also, you know, in a position of leadership in relation to your creative practice, right? That there are these opportunities to kind of set into frame, you know, what does it mean to be a working artist who, you know, understands what it is to live in the world creatively, in addition to, of course, to hold space for other creative folks. And then, of course, Lizania, with your organizing work, right? I'm you know, appreciative of the fact that that in its own right takes on a practice that, you know, is multidimensional and intersectional with other places, spaces, and communities. So I'd love to hear, you know, a bit from you all in terms of just the ways in which maybe you've hoped for models of care or seen models of care enacted that maybe call forward some of those feminist practices.
I'll jump in because I've been so inspired by JAM, the exhibition at MoMA, and one of the things that struck me the most was seeing like Linda Goodbryan's children's photograph, and sort of like how they explained that this was also a space where the kids were coming, you know, they were taking care of the kids collectively. So that, and it also makes me think of, like, for instance, the National Women's Liberation Movement. One of the things that we're fighting for is the double day, is like the idea that, you know, we actually do work double, from going from the, you know, the 9 to 5, whatever you want to call it, to then going to like the care labor that is oftentimes invisible. So, you know, I do think, like, I wish institutions would have like more of a practice of like what it would look like to have daycare in an institution when you're installing a show, what it would look like to have, you know, or if it's not there, how come, like, you know, we have a panel and perhaps there could be like daycare also provided as a stipend. So those types of those are monetary kind of like systematic things that I think about. But then I community-wise and collectively, I wonder, and I know like groups of mothers that kind of like share that sort of labor, and sort of like, what are the practices outside of like the capitalist systems that we're in that we could take care of each other, you know? Yeah, and I'll leave it there.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Are there other thoughts of folks on the panel?
Is it about the institutions?
Yeah. I mean, I will say, Leilah, like there was an image, for example, recently that many folks were sending around. I think it was of Stewart Hall inside of a creche, and it was a photo that many people, I think, were circulating very widely. And it occurred to me as I was reflecting about this image that it's largely because the way in which networks of care are imaged inside of academic space, institutional space, and then of course as well in studio space, right? Really, the questions of visibility or invisibility of one's chosen family, and how, of course, that functions or is performed, right? What that line is supposed to be often is deeply dictated by maybe some of the sort of stringent nature of what institutions are not supposed to show, right, or accommodate. And so, for me, when I think about this question of, what does an institution do to serve, right, this feminist mission or this question of feminism now, those are the things maybe that come to mind. But I'm curious to hear from you, Leilah. It seems like maybe you have a few things that you might want to share.
Thank you very much. I literally, when I start looking at institutions as an artist straight from Africa, and I've basically been here. This is my 7th year, and I basically, truthfully, reading about, I've just jumped into reading about, okay, what is going on into the museums. And when you look at the percentage, actually, I've literally put my focus basically on the Whitney Museum. And actually when I tapped it in, it actually came up with a percentage that was showing 80% of the art shown in museums is white, and 87% of it is male. And that means we have less than 25 of women art being shown in museums, all other art spaces. But then it comes back to the fact that I as a visual artist and a woman who is now showing my work in different museums, and now some museums are collecting my work, to me it kind of makes me feel that there is an open way of how now museums are welcoming a female artist. Right now we have a whole big show that is going on at the Aldrich, which is 26 females added on to the other 26 females, which is 52 female artists in one group show. And when you also look at my latest work, which has been collected by the Hammer, I personally think there is a welcoming of female artworks. I'm recently in the same show with Kiyan Williams, the Brooklyn Bridge. So to me, it feels like there is a welcoming of more women in the art shows and in art institutions. I'm not so sure about other institutions like accounting, other lawyers, those other professions, but I'm talking about the arts. And what I've read about, the little I've read about the institutions, and I'm also giving a little credit because of my work that has been collected by these other museums. I have a piece that was also collected recently by the Whitney, and when you look at the percentage, it still has a low percentage of works being collected by women in their collection.
Exactly.
So that would be my take.
I think that's it's great to think about that question of collecting practices, because I think it's a key component of some of the ways in which strategically we can think differently about what does exhibition making serve as a model, right, inside of an institution. When we see more and more the kind of rosters of exhibitions, right, that center different voices, different histories that actually deserve more space, right, and should be at the center of the dialogue, right, and have maybe for far too long existed or been kind of pushed to the margins. But I love calling Linda Goodbryant into the room as well, speaking of icons, because I do think it's really important to set Lepard's exhibition into a kind of fuller frame. I know that, she really felt very strongly about the sort of possibility of the original exhibition as being a kind of curatorial intervention. And that was something that was really critical. But it is, important to say that obviously in 1968, the Studio Museum was founded, right? So that was kind of prior to the 71. And then in 1971, alongside of this period of time within that 12 months, right? The kitchen was founded. El Museo del Barrio was founded in 1969. Samela Lewis's amazing and groundbreaking international review of African American art came into being in 1972. AAR Gallery, which was mentioned before, was founded as well in 1972. And then, of course, just above Midtown, which of course is having its phenomenal presence at MoMA right now, was founded in 1974. And that, was just several years before the new museum was founded. So these are all these different sites that I think we're trying to think differently about what it meant, first of all, to have women involved in its kind of origin, as a kind of site of planning, and what is that blueprint? How can that function? As well as thinking about the collective practice of bringing folks together to kind of revision what publics can do, what art can do. So, I am keen with that in mind as we think about maybe a broader constellation than, 1971 and the original show, which maybe is why we're all here, to kind of maybe ask about what does it mean to think about artist-driven space, right? Because I appreciate that the way that functions can be both formal or institutionalized, professionalized in a certain way, right? But also at the same time, right? I've found that there have been moments where, artist-driven space is sometimes as well the community that is built in collaboration within the studio, right? Even. So, I'm curious to hear about what that might mean to you, and what are the ways in which, if not through a feminist frame, right? Perhaps if, as an alternative, right, that it is something that is a call and response to maybe a different idea of what intersectional work can look like. These are some legendary examples, AR Gallery, just above Midtown, right? So of course, noting that these are the things that we kind of have a fuller form on because they are existing kind of in our history, right? But thinking about this moment right now, each of you in your own practices, the communities that you build around your work, your collaborators.
Are we still talking about kind of like institutions in terms of, and maybe like alternatives to those?
Yeah, or community building as well, right? Which I think is really critical to this equation, because, the ways in which those things can occur, right? Building a network around one's practice certainly does not have to be viewed through the valence of an institutional site, right? There are so many other ways in which that network can be built. Yeah.
Well, I guess thinking about those, I've been involved with institutions in like a lot of different kinds of ways of like, some ways of being kind of like an admin, someone working in the institution. Sometimes it's like an educator working more kind of like within a space as an adjunct. Sometimes it's like an artist that's just relating to a space for like a certain amount of time. And recently like joined as a member of AIR, which is like a very much still kind of like self-selected group and community. And I think, I'm not totally sure what the kind of question is. Maybe it's like how those alternative spaces function. And I've been thinking like versus like an institution, and I think a lot of it in terms of like documentation and legacy. And especially in spaces like AIR, and maybe it's just because we've been talking a lot about it as like a group of like, what does that mean? Like who decides, like basically history, and who gets to decide that? And I feel like a lot of times within institutions, so much of it, unless there is kind of like frameworks and like the work that's done by the artist to document that, a lot of times it will kind of be something that is then molded into a narrative that is really like in service of the institution and the institutional narrative. But in those kind of like alternative spaces, there's way more room to like self-document and decide for yourself, like what is the history of this space? What is the legacy of it? And that's like the difficult thing too, because I think with everything, there's parallel histories that are happening constantly. And it really depends like who you ask, like whose perspective gets like literally just gets written down and gets like passed down.
Absolutely. Yeah. So kind of speaking to the archive. Kiyan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm like thinking also to your last question about sort of engaging with institutions to like expand like perhaps like networks or practices of care and how that relates to community building. And for me, what that looks like is like, well, like, you know, I came up and like really incubated as an artist within kind of like quote unquote alternative, like Black queer community, like Black queer and trans and like Black and brown queer and trans creative practitioners, organized largely through like artist driven like residency programs that like wanted to create community and incubators and like resources specifically for like folks to just have access to like and like to create in community with like other folks who are like interested in like being in sort of autonomous kind of spaces. And in that same kind of spirit and tradition, I attempt to like, you know, whenever I am interfacing with, you know, institutions to like leverage resources to then loop back into that kind of like community building and like care practice that other folks sort of cultivated for me. That could look like many things, like doing a fellowship and like advocating for like artists to like have more like have access to like better, like more production funds, or like have access to like funds to support and like equitably pay studio assistants who then become mentees, who then become a part of like a network around which you like sort of cultivate creative community. But I think that a lot of that looks like, you know, just resource sharing and redistribution. And out of the spirit of like wanting to like, or just like wanting to like continue this practice that I've so deeply benefited from.
I think often about this question of the studio space and also artists who have skill shared inside of studio space as being something that's really critical to the building of a practice. And, you know, there are so many examples that, you know, I could cite of ways in which artists who I've worked closely with have had, you know, family in the studio, friends in the studio. Really, this idea of building a project as being something that, you know, extends beyond the monetary resource, right? It's about the asks that often are being made in intimacy with one another as you're building friendships and community, and thinking about a way in which, you know, models of survival can be expanded in a moment too, where you know, sort of practices can be faced with questions of sustainability, right, and precarity too. So I appreciate that deeply, Kiyan, and you know, it does make me think about you know, thinking about, for example, the Guerrilla Girls, right? So in 1988, the amazing collective, the Guerrilla Girls, created this mini manifesto called The Advantages of Being a Woman Artist. And it was kind of tongue in cheek. And many people have shared and reshared the imaging from this, because I think it continues to be quite a live nerve, maybe is the best way of putting it. So, you know, just to read a few aloud, right, in terms of some of the advantages, you know, one of them is having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs, or not being stuck in a tenured teaching position, or not having to be in shows with men, or one of my personal favorites, not having to choke on those Italian cigars or paint in Italian suits, which I have to say, why not? We can still. But just, you know, reflecting on this idea, right, of the advantage, and also too, maybe Aya, to go back to your maybe original prompt or kind of question framing about this idea of feminism, right? Like how it is applied on top of things. What does it mean to maybe to claim that or not? So I'm wondering, you know, to this point of advantages, right? If you feel that, you know, this idea of the kind of advantages of being a woman artist, this manifesto as a material, is something that still resonates. Are those things that maybe you still see in the world that you still feel like we have work to do on?
Oh my God, I was just telling
Yes.
someone, sorry, I was just telling someone like that I feel like I have 4 jobs. And when I looked at this poster again, and I was like, oh my God, how do we have pushed the needle, like in some ways, because like, yeah, like those advantages are still the advantages. There's still very much the core true of what being a self-identified woman in the arts means, to me at least. So
Yeah. And I
Can
think
I-
it deepens with age almost as well. Like I remember seeing this in early art history classes as a curator, right? And it was kind of like tongue in cheek, felt all, you know, deep theory, right? Like this idea of kind of almost studying it as an artifact of the past, when certainly it lives with us now, it feels like. But Leilah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I was like, kind of, fascinated on, how to, bring up issues as an artist, and you kind of, take them in as an artist, because you feel like you won't have questions of you doing something as an artist, because you're an artist, you can do whatever you want to do. And as an activist, I feel like I've kind of jumped that role of being questioned. However, I'm questioned at times, but well, the art is already there speaking. And now I'm pulling it up on the traditional malware when I show up on my shows, on my exhibition, like solo shows or just openings, and I just dress up in a royal traditional male dress. And it's questioning up, putting up a lot of questions. Oh, you're a woman putting on this. You're not supposed to do it. And I'm like, okay, as an artist, I'm going to push it forward. I'm going to cut trousers into it. I'm going to do it as a shirt. As an artist, nobody's going to question me. Of course, they'll still talk, but the artwork will still be out there. It kind of gives you a freedom and liberty to do whatever you want as an artist. That is what I wanted to.
I love that frame. Yeah, I love that frame, and thinking about this idea of artist as emancipatory in many ways, right? Gives us the permission to kind of push against and really actually at the same time really like let go of maybe some of what feels like the requirements of what it means to be in the arts. I say in the arts because I'm wary of this idea of the art world, right? It feels like a relatively new formation, one that maybe looks very different now than it did when Lepard originally ideated and realized this first show. But yeah, certainly appreciate that, this material of being an artist, right, as an identity allows maybe for some elasticity to be made possible. Are there other thoughts on that?
Is that under the tradition of feminist practice?
I love that question. Is it? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to ask. I think that it's a good question. I don't know, Kiyan, you look like you're about to say something.
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
we're getting in now.
Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud, but it makes me think of like, what does a like I guess one like questions that it brings up and that perhaps the show brings up or breaks open is like, what does a feminist art practice looks like? Like, are there a set of, I think like, are there a set of like visual and aesthetic practices around which feminist art practice today might coalesce? I think even more like, what does like, I think about these kinds of questions in terms of like art created by various like marginalized communities. Like, what does a trans visual practice look like? Or I haven't, like, these are all questions because I haven't arrived anywhere. But one of the things that like, I guess I'm interested in, both in terms of like, as I'm like thinking about like communities of artists that I'm engaging with and like building a sort of set of practices around, like I wonder if, well, how do I name this? To think back to Aya's earlier question, in terms of like a certain type of creative freedom to like operate across a range of like visual practices. Okay. Like I often wonder what are the institutions and where are the spaces supporting like experimental, fugitive practices for people who engage with or identify as feminists or as Black or as queer or as trans. Yeah, so those are some of the things that, and it particularly like beyond or perhaps outside of like a mode of representation, which feels like the zeitgeist of where we live in right now, or like a particular moment of the art world, the art worlds that we inhabit.
Yeah, and I love you're saying art worlds, Kiyan, because I so think often about this question of risk, right? That so much of what maybe is afforded to that 80% that Leilah mentioned inside of institutional space of men and potentially also of white people, right? Existing in this idea of that as being a center of art history, which is not the center for everyone. That the question maybe becomes, what is the thing that defines privilege within that? And so much of the privilege is defined by who gets to take risks. And so the risks, I think, are something that, really is at stake here in this discussion, and almost extends beyond this question of maybe feminism and its whatever its origination is, however that's defined, because it certainly is blurry. But instead, it pushes us further to think about this future, right? Like, what are we building towards, right? What are the ways in which space can be held and maintained for folks to take risk, and have that maybe exist away from the pressures of a professionalized art world, right? Because that is not the place really often where experimentation and discovery can occur, right? It has to occur in other sites, right? In that jam space, as Linda Goodbrien certainly guides us towards through the history of the phenomenal work that she's done. I do want to open up, we have some minutes left. I can't believe time is flying, and I have a million more questions, but there's a lovely question that's in the chat from Rachel. And so I just want to give a moment to kind of call that into the room. Rachel asks, is it unique to be part of such a large show with women or female identifying artists? And has it been special to be part of a show that has so many artists from an older generation? So I am curious about that, because, to this generational question feels really important. And I will say that, to broaden very intentionally, right, the curatorial frame within this was, for femme identified artists, for female identifying artists, and for non-binary artists to be brought into the conversation beyond Lepard's original frame. So, are there any thoughts about that? What does that mean to be kind of, in exchange across generations inside of this history, but also really at a certain point, breaking away from Lepard's original vision?
I think it's learning from each other and learning from history itself, and also believing that there are women even before us that still wanted to feel like they wanted to be equal, and they wanted their voices to be put out there. When you look at all the work that is in the show, for sure, for real, it is real art, and it's in the 80s. It's seriously like really beautiful work, and it all has real points of women at that time coming up and wanting to talk about what they really want to talk about. And that, as artists of our generation, we feel like, yes, we have to push it forward for the other generation to come in front of us to kind of push it up until we get to where we want to be. Like for if we have statistics right now on Google, on Wikipedia, that shows like 80% of the art in the museums is male. Where the women, there are the women artists who need to be represented. We can't be 50-50 because their work is covered somewhere. So with this kind of question, it brings us to the fact that it empowers us to feel like, yes, we can also get there at a certain point. We have people to look onto. That is how I think I can explain that.
That's super fantastic. Thank you. Are there other thoughts, Luciana, Aya?
In response to Rachel's question?
Yeah, just thinking about this question across generations, right? Thinking about as well the generational, I'll call it a divide, right? But thinking about the origin site, 1971, where this exhibition came from, and this moment right now, right? Because it's a very different moment in history. Are there any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, first, I think this is like a super unique show that we're all in, that is like this really, I mean, half of it is also bringing back like this really historical show, and just being able to like collect all of those again, I think was one feat, but then to try and kind of like create almost like a second iteration of that is like a whole other thing. Because I think it's also, I mean, just like in the 70s, this idea of what feminism or what that even looks like now, I think is changing and really depends on who you ask. So I think like to be able to do that, and I think like, for all of us, it's like, yeah, that's a super unique kind of thing. But the intergenerational part, I think that is just like necessary. It has to happen. I think, it's like, and also I think that we're like, we're kind of like the newer generation in this, but we're not like the new generation anymore. There's already like a new generation of folks and a new generation of artists.
The babies, I love them.
So it's like, also how can we, as in this position, make way for the next generation too, and to continue that, like continue growing intergenerationally, but also like, what does that mean? It means like, yeah, bring together people from like, yeah, different places in the world, maybe different kind of like backgrounds, maybe different kind of like socioeconomic standings. It's like, how can, the only way to kind of create more conversation is by crossing over things that we think are like boundaries with that.
Yeah, and I think to riff off of Aya, this also ties into like a earlier question, Legacy, that you were having on how do we build community. I think like as a feminist practice, it's making sure that we open doors, or we kind of like become also mentors, mentees, like we kind of it's the lineage, right? Like I think one of the things that was so inspirational beyond so many other things of the Loophole Retreat was that Simone Lee organized, was amazing to see the Spillman, like students introduce like the older generation, but the conversation of how that all happened, and looking at her practice, like she's really someone that brings community forward oftentimes. So I think that's key, and it is like a super unique perspective to be in this show and kind of like acknowledge those things as well.
And I think it's really, and it's great to bring up Simone Lee and Rashida Bumray's Loophole of Retreat, because that is such a prime example of the way too that maybe it's the feminist strategies, right? What does feminism teach us? It teaches us about sharing and holding space. It teaches us about network building and discourse and pedagogy, right? And what how that can be expanded, and perhaps the title of feminist, right? While it is not shared, it's the strategies of it that can do important work across different generations. But Kiyan, I do want to go back, in our kind of final minutes to kind of bring Beverly Buchanan and Ana Mendieta into the room, because it blows my mind when I think about Ana Mendieta. I always think about her kind of as a peer, and it's strange because most recently it occurred to me that if she were alive today, she would probably be about 74 years old, and so it is remarkable. Gives me even just a chill to say that, because this idea not only, of course, of how artists are imaged, right, through their history, but also certainly too what it means to hold a position as an elder, right, as one grows through and beyond their work, and as also as one is carried, right, by the publics that receive and really build memory around it, which certainly is the case both with Buchanan and Mendieta alike. So I think it's an important maybe juncture to kind of maybe reflect on as we turn to our final minutes here, to bring maybe the language and writing of Howard Dean Pindell into the room, who actually in 97 had written, in an attempt to be optimistic, I look forward to the next decade and the new millennium, bringing more positive changes. And certainly we're in that millennium right now. So, I guess as a maybe final question before we conclude, I want to maybe reflect on that, right? This idea of being in the new millennium, with folks who are growing with us, what it means to kind of grow up and older and outward in all of the gorgeous ways that each of you continue to do, and holding space for one another and of course for others too. And as well, maybe to turn to the final question from Betsy G in the chat, who asked about whether you were aware of each other before this exhibition, and as well if there were other artists besides those maybe we began with, right? We began with some select icons or iconic ideas, right? And we need to end on some other icons to call into the room as we reflect on this question of future. Betsy's kind of asking you to turn to those older generations, right? Are there folks that you knew that were here, and folks maybe that you wish you were here, right? Could be here with us, and how that might manifest. Any thoughts on that? Maybe start with the easy part. Did you know each other before this exhibition? Folks want to know.
Oh my God, am I on or am I off? Am I on?
You're on now.
You're on now.
Okay,
Yeah, I think so many of us
Kiyan?
have exhibited together. Like Leilah and I are in a public sculpture exhibition that's on view in Brooklyn Bridge Park. Currently, Aya and I, we were both fellows in Socrates Sculpture Park. Was that 2 years ago?
Yeah, 2
I
years
think it
ago,
was-
2020.
Wow.
You know how
It felt
years
like
It was a different- it was a different time.
2018. Yeah. Okay.
So yes, you did know each other. Yeah. So
Mhm.
folks are, they're exhibiting together. They're, and I Lizania, I know that you were just saying a couple weeks ago you were chatting. These are
Yeah,
discussions
we're good
that
friends.
have been ongoing. Yeah. So
I think
to answer that
good
question,
buddies
for
with
sure.
Kiyan too.
I love that. So then maybe to turn to the final part of that question is, who for you maybe is the older generation? Because you're saying that maybe we are the older generation, which, has me shook, right? I'm ready for it, but am I ready for it? And then, thinking as well of, calling Ms. Mendieta into the room, right? That it is remarkable to think about that amazing force of nature as a human being 74 years old, right? And what that could have meant. And of course, all the instruction that has continued to arc to the fore into this moment now, in terms of the ways in which her work has taught us and guided us. So are there other next generations and or older generations, right, that have been inspiring to you as we kind of wrap up and we ask about this question of future, right? What is that future of feminism?
Okay. Can I basically go? Can I go for the question?
Yes, please.
Yes, go.
Okay, sure, thanks. I think as I always say, want to talk about Africa, basically from the continent, because I started from Africa, and it's so rewarding to talk about my, professors or people that have inspired me back home and who still inspire me, the elder generation. When you look at Lilian Nabulime, taught me how to sculpt at Makerere University. I look at Margaret Nagawa, who actually right now is in the US, doing her PhD in Georgia, Atlanta. The late Maria Naita, very, very good sculptor. I look at Stella Nyanzi, who recently protested while she put her boobs out. She just woke up and said, well, how can I talk to the government if they're not listening to me at that time? She just undressed. And there is no way I can just keep her in people that are really fearless to talk about the dictator, to talk to the dictator by undressing themselves. Very famous lawyer, Sylvia Tamale, who kind of came up with, she really stood up when the gay bill was written as a lawyer. She came in as a lawyer. and said, I'm a lawyer. He was a human rights activist. And there is no way I can really not feel like that really inspired me and they're inspiring me. And then for the, there's also other African-American people that I can still talk about that have also kind of helped and chipped in my career in different ways. When you look at McLean Thomas, when she, and her partner came up with a show at Parish Museum that was basically women, and it was very successful. This, they really want, their space is to empower other, young women in the arts. Who else?
No, I think that this is
it will be a very endless list, actually.
It's a syllabi, which I think it's just so rich and such a appreciative moment to have, obviously, these amazing references to turn on. But we're a little bit over time. I want to maybe give a few moments to our other speakers to see if there are any other final ancestors, folks of prior generation that we want to name and put forward before we wrap up.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
I can go really quickly, but I don't know. I kind of think of like the folks who have like impacted my life from when I've been like young, and really kind of thinking of even folks like Faith Ringgold, who's like my first interaction with them was through like children's books. Or like people like Alma Thomas, who like wasn't recognized until later in her life, but was an educator for so long and making work. And really, I feel like there's so many folks that will continue to go unnamed and continue, but, and like whose efforts won't be written down or won't be recognized, but still like doing the work of what that means and in like all different kinds of realms. And it makes me think of just back to like my Okinawan roots, where like so much of the history and culture and society was built around females and matriarchal systems, like spiritual leaders, political leaders. And that I think is something that is something that is kind of like really at like the origin of a lot of our society, and something that like, how can we kind of open that up and update that and, bring back these ideas of like care into how we just relate to each other. Yeah.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. It's the best question to put forward that we can maybe continue to carry with us. So thank you so much, Kiyan, Lizania, Leilah, Aya. Just a delight and honor to be in the room with you, Iconic Four. And as well, thank you, of course, to the Aldrich and the phenomenal organizers of this very special exhibition. For those of you who have not seen it, please go check it out. There's also a gorgeous publication with work to spend time with that I encourage you to also spend a moment with, either digitally or by picking up a physical copy. So we wish you all a lovely evening, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.